Hey, this is Uncle Timo coming back at you. Well, let's see what happens. This is a new battle. It's Smolensk. So you know what that means? That means new airplane. We're no longer flying the I-16. We're flying the Lag-3, shockingly equipped with RS-82 rockets. Now, you might think, hey, those are ground attackers. No, they're not. The Soviets were the ones who were employing air-to-air rockets in actual combat. This actually happened at Khalkin Gol / Nomonhan, which was the most important battle of World War II. I know if you're American or British or German, you will say, no, Uncle Timo, you're an idiot. The most important battle, according to my book, was, and then you take a pick of Stalingrad, D-Day, or Kursk. Well, depends on what country you're born in. Obviously, the UK guys and Americans will say D-Day, which is bull crap for sure. And then the Russians will say, well, Stalingrad, and which makes more sense, but still close but no cigar. The most important battle was Khalkin Gol. What was the Battle of Khalkin Gol or Nomonhan, depending on, again, where you're born? Well, Empire of Japan was very aggressive in the 30s, and they had staged, their armed forces were staging what was called incidents, which is basically the old colonial policy that the European powers were doing, except they're doing it in the 19th century and not the 20th century. So what they did was they staged a military incident where the enemy troops and our troops were shooting at each other, and then we could say, hey, those other guys are shooting at us. Let's take over the country because they started it. So that's what happened. Japanese Empire started a war with China over what's called the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where Japanese, sources are murky who started it, but I have my suspicions, where Japanese troops are fired upon by the terrible Chinese guys who were in China, and Japanese guys were occupying Chinese territory already, and they were fired on, and we must protect Japanese interests, so let's take over all of China, which is what they tried to do. And then we had the 1937, I believe, to 1945 Sino, Chinese-Japanese War. And the Japanese Empire, the guys in the Kwantung Army, which was based on the Soviet border. It was in actually a country called Manchukuo, which was a puppet of Japan, but it was a legal fiction. Anyway, those guys were basically chomping on the bit, and they just wanted to but they wanted some military glory too. Plus, they figured that, hey, China is not the main enemy. The main enemy of Japan is international communism, which is Moscow, which is USSR. So what they did was they staged an incident. Actually, they staged several incidents. They really wanted war with Soviet Union. They staged the Changkufeng incident, which the Soviet Union kind of sort of lost. They shot up some river ships, Soviet river ships, and the Soviet Union was not the forces there, the pograničniki, which were the border troops, NKVD border troops, and the infantry guys who were based there. They were shooting back. They weren't saying, Stalin did not say no provocation. No, they were shooting back. They were sending armed trawlers and armed river ships to shoot back. And the first major incident was really Changkufeng. Marshal Blucher, I believe, I can't remember the name. It was a German name, but it was a Soviet general. He didn't do such a good job. Later on, he was shot. Common fate for people like that in the Soviet Union. But then in Nomonhan / Khalkin Gol, the Japanese got serious. They really wanted to expand this incident into a war, just like Marco Polo Bridge with China. Even though they got the high command, the Japanese high command, were sending generals there, direct from Tokyo. They're flying there in their airplanes, transport airplanes, and we're saying to Kwantung Army, guys, we have a war with China now. That's our main theater of operations. We do not want war with Soviet Union because we don't want to have war on two fronts. But the Kwantung Army, they're so independent They wanted this war with Soviet Union. They wanted glory. So they wanted their own Marco Polo Bridge incident, except on the Soviet border, Soviet-Japanese border. So it was an undeclared war. It was a mini war, and it was important from both political and military history points of view, and I'll explain why. Uh, First of all, from military point of view, um, hundreds of fighters and bombers were partaking in air combat in a very, very small area. Speaking of air combat, they go fast. They go 300, 200, 300, 400 kilometers per hour. So it was a very small area with a huge concentration, very high concentration of battle aircraft, right? Bombers, ground attackers, fighters. And we're talking hundreds. We're talking air battles with hundreds of airplanes. This was the first time that it really happened. Spain did not really have that. The modern air combat was born just there in a remote village called Nomonhan, which is village. I mean, it was just a couple of yurts, which were tents. The people who were living there were basically Mongoloid, no offense, oh my God, racist. No, it's Mongoloid, Mongols, guys like that, who are basically, their job was to, have their cows and horses, and when stuff got bad in one town, they just packed up their yurts, their tents, and went to another place when, the animals ate all the grass. That's what they did. Um, it was a really backwards area and really insignificant area. That's why the Japanese picked it, because it was far, far away from the Soviet, main rail lines and stuff like that. Um, so, militarily speaking, lots of new technologies on display. Monoplane fighters, both Japanese, and the Japanese precursor of Zero was there, the Ki-27, and both Japanese and Soviet, which was I-16s. Lots of Chaikas, I-153s, and I-16s were there. Lots of new weapon systems. The Soviets were using air-to-air rockets, which are shown here. First use in combat, right there. Khalkin Gol, Soviets versus Japanese, and Soviet Air Force did that. So lots of weapon systems were there, and they were, this was the first really modern air combat. Why do I say this battle was the most important of World War II? Well, without, why is it Stalingrad or Kursk or, D-Day? Uncle Timo, you're wrong. No, you are wrong. I am correct. This could have been turned into a Soviet-Japanese war, just like Marco Polo Bridge incident could have been turned into was turned into a Japanese-Chinese war, right? This could have really spiraled out of control like that, and that's what the Kwantung Army wanted. So we could have had a Japanese-Soviet war in 1939, right? This could have happened. But let's say that Zhukov, who was sent there, this is the victory of Zhukov. Without Khalkin Gol, there is no Zhukov. He would not have been promoted. He would not have been promoted to head Stavka. And without Khalkin Gol, there would have been no Zhukov. He would have been, pretty much unknown. Or worse, he could have been shot if, if he did badly. Let's say the Soviet Union, they actually won this. Zhukov did a brilliant encirclement. The Soviet sources in the Soviet academies were calling this the Second Cannae, which is what Hannibal did to Romans. They said it was studied in, after this battle was studied in the Soviet Union as the perfect encirclement. They were basically telling the officers, that's how you do an encirclement. Do what Zhukov did at Khalkin Gol. So, let's say that Zhukov loses it. First of all, he would get shot out of hand, Stalin would have shot him. He would have died. And no more Zhukov in Stavka. Think about that. No more Zhukov in World War II. That's number one. Number two, let's say that there is no, let's speculate a little bit. Let's say there is no Japanese-Soviet war in 1939. Let's say they don't, the Japanese don't really do it. They're not that aggressive. They're happy with just kicking Soviet ass, right? So let's say the Japanese win it and Soviet Union is humiliated, right? What happens in 1941? Japanese, instead of attacking America and Holland, Dutch East Indies, where the oil was, or maybe while they're doing it, they keep strong Kwantung army. And they actually in 1941 it was very strong still until they started pulling forces to help stem the tide in 43-44 against the Americans. So what happens? Let's say the Kwantung army in 1941 goes on the offensive. It doesn't matter if they succeed or not. It does not matter. What happens in 1941 if the Kwantung army, if Japan declares war on the Soviet Union and the Kwantung army goes on the attack? I don't care if they all die. What happens is the Soviet Far East forces are not. Historically, what happened was they were transported from the border because the Soviet spy, who was actually a German citizen in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, his main goal in his operations, spying operations in Japan, was not to discover as much information as he can. No, he was tasked with putting Japanese aggression into the Western countries, capitalist countries, and away from the Soviet Union, a task that he succeeded at brilliantly. That's not part of the official history, especially in America and UK, because the American and United Kingdom historians are basically just crap. They have no idea what we're writing. They don't use primary sources. They don't do interviews. They don't go into unit histories, much less, have access to, or even if they did, they can't read Russian anyway, so it doesn't matter. Other than Glantz, who basically was given some very little, access to the Soviet archives, but nothing like the Sorge file. Anyway, he and his organization, spying organization, succeeded brilliantly in, helping Japan go against America, UK, the Dutch, and away from the Soviet Union. Now, what happens if the Soviets lose Khalkin Gol? Well, Japan attacked Soviet Union in 41 alongside Germany and other Axis powers like Romania, Hungary, Slovakia. Those forces have to stay there to defend the flank. Those forces have to fight the Japanese. They cannot be transported in 1941 to save Moscow, right? The first successful Allied counter-offensive, actually strategic offensive, in World War II. Second. The first one was General Wavell in the desert in 1940. They routed the Italians. But anyway, the really one that counted, in my opinion, because the desert was a sideshow. There were like a couple of divisions fighting there. Yes, the UK people will say, "Oh my God, it was very important defending Egypt." Yes, we had 300 divisions fighting on the Eastern Front and 3 divisions, fighting in the desert. Yes, yawn, great. Anyway, moving on. Those divisions in 1941 who were transported to help save Moscow and then launch the first meaningful strategic Allied offensive. It was Moscow 1941. They would have stayed there. They would not be available to save Moscow. Worst case scenario then, Moscow falls in 1941. You can imagine what happens then. Chances are Soviet Union falls. Nightmare scenario for the world, right? Let's say Moscow is saved. Even best case scenario, Moscow is saved because of winter and the troops desperate fighting. Soviet Union saved Moscow in 1941. No 1941 counteroffensive, right? No Soviet counteroffensive. The German forces stay in place close to Moscow. They are not thrown back hundreds of kilometers away from Moscow. They stay back. They do not take catastrophic losses. They can dig in and get warm. They can dig in and are not really bothered by any Soviet forces because there aren't any. They are fighting the Japanese. There are no reserves to launch attacks on them, or at least not as many. So German infantry and Wehrmacht do not take catastrophic losses in manpower. In 1942, actually, in 1941, there were 3 army groups and they're all advancing. North, South, and Center. They're all advancing. In 1942, because of the catastrophic losses that they took in the campaign, especially in the Moscow counteroffensive, during, which basically happened because they got all the troops, or as many troops as they could, away from the far east front and gotten them to Moscow, right? The Wehrmacht was not able to advance everywhere. They could only advance in one area, and there were discussions in the German high command, guys, where do we advance? North, south, or center? Do we advance against Moscow, which many German generals wanted to do? Do we advance against Leningrad, which was basically, a prestige target, but it was basically starved to death and it was a non-factor strategically, right? Or do we advance in the south? And actually, interestingly, this is a different topic from Khalkin Gol. The Soviets said they weren't stupid. They said, Stalin and the rest of them in the Stavka said, well, obviously we're going to advance on Moscow, right? So we have to strengthen the Moscow front. But Hitler, the great gambler, kind of figured it out and said, no, no, no. We leave Moscow alone. It's a prestige target. We want to take the Caucasus, where the oil is, the Baku area. And we're going to cut the Volga, right, where Stalingrad is. We know what the Volga River is. That's where the river traffic is, which they use to bring ships, river ships with oil up that river to supply the Soviet war machine. Also, Stalingrad is a huge railroad hub. And railroad hubs, railroad stations were extremely important. Railroads were extremely important. That's the transport of stuff. That's the main transport for the military. In this case, especially oil from the Baku area, from the Caucasus, to the fighting, units of the Red Army in Moscow and Leningrad. That's where the oil was coming from for them. So what the Germans did in 1942 was actually very smart. They went after the Caucasus and wanted to cut the Volga, which they accomplished, partially, but really they accomplished. And they wanted to get into the Caucasus. Well, the problem was that they weren't strong enough. After the Moscow 1941 counteroffensive, they captured a few oil fields, and I recommend Mr. Forchik and some other author wrote about the raids on the, how the German special forces, and it was a very fascinating campaign because the Brandenburgers were dressed as the Soviet NKVD, perfectly Russian-speaking, Germans and traitors to the Soviet Union, Russian guys. They were dressed as NKVD troops, and they actually based themselves in cities and told the other guys to retreat, that they will, yes, our guys will demolish the bridge when the enemy German comes, when they come. And they actually captured oil fields and bridges to help the Wehrmacht advance there. Anyway, off tangent, different tangent of topic totally. But what I wanted to end this with is that 1941, without that counteroffensive and the catastrophic losses that the Wehrmacht took in that counteroffensive, the winter counteroffensive, the Germans could have been strong to take Caucasus. So we can see this ripple effect, the domino effect. Without Khalkin Gol 1, the Japan could have been at war with the Soviet Union in 39 and or 41. They could have attacked. Maybe America would have not been attacked if the Soviets were thought to be so weak right before the picking that Japan would say, hey, we're going to take Siberia. That's where the oil is. Forget these little dinky islands. And then America is not at war. So that's, you can see the domino effect. You can see the ripple effect. It's all from this Battle of Khalkin Gol, which was not a small battle. That's why I say the Battle of Khalkin Gol / Nomonhan is the most important battle of World War II, is the most important battle of our era. And I'm sure I'm gonna, if somebody watches this and they watch it to the end, they will say, no, you're wrong. I am British, German, Russian, Polish, French, Dutch. And I know that the most important battle of World War II is Kursk, D-Day, Moscow, Stalingrad, blah, blah, blah. No, you're wrong. I'm right. That's just the way it is. Maybe history will catch up to what really happened and was, and maybe history will be changed to what really was important. I doubt it. Basically, the historians are crap, and there's history, and then there's what really happened. So I go with what really happened. I do the analysis, and I tell you, the truth, basically. And for, the official propaganda version of the war, including the most important battle, you can go to your, national history books and, we can then argue over D-Day or Stalingrad or Moscow, or the British laughingly will say, "Oh no, the desert, the El Alamein, where 5 divisions versus 5 divisions were fighting, is the most crucial, important battle of World War II." Well, I'm gonna leave with that piece of comedy there. So, yeah. Okay, cutting the video, and I will fly the mission after this.